All right, going to do Robert Greene's Mastery, or the introduction from Robert Greene's Mastery. That's this book right here. Worth reading, by the way. Robert Greene's kind of his book that kind of made him famous would have been this one, The 48 Laws of Power. Also an interesting book. And Greene's a good writer and has a way of excellent sort of researcher, and has a way of sort of through storytelling, kind of bringing his concepts to life. This is part of a group of three lectures, obviously, for our class. The other one will be Malcolm Gladwell's chapter, 10,000 Hour Chapters from his Outliers book, and Cal Newport's So Good They Can't Ignore You. All three of these, and I'll only be covering Greene's in this one to keep it short, but I will also, I guess, cover K. Anders Ericsson in this lecture. All three of these, the reason I kind of designed this class, so we're doing our research papers now, right? And this is, you are getting one big bulk of sort of raw research from a professor. He actually passed away recently, and he was in Florida, I believe. K. Anders Ericsson was his name, who, by the way, wrote his own book called Peak, that's worth reading as well. And basically, K. Anders Ericsson studied greatness, and that is how one, skill acquisition, how one gets exceptionally good at something, which is it can be kind of a fascinating study. It can be a not easy thing to study. But some of his basic conclusions, I think, are important to keep in mind. They'll be carried on throughout these three pieces. And basically, all three of the men here that we're going to study that wrote about this all used a sort of different sort of theoretical and interpretive lens through which to filter and shape this research, K. Anders Ericsson's research. And again, K. Anders Ericsson studied everyone everything from chess masters to tennis pros to the musicians that went on to the violinists that ended up in the New York Philharmonic, that sort of thing, to sports stars, to writers, to everything, anything you could think of, any sort of little aspect of life or different vocation you can imagine. Nurses, doctors. He studied like the ones who became stockbrokers, the ones who became like the upper top 5%, maybe even top 1%, sort of in their field. And basically, his interest was how they got there. And he did come up with some patterns that tended to be across board from everything from pianists to ball players, right? And part of that was that one of his main findings was, as far as he was concerned, talent, at least as we think of it, didn't. I don't know if he quite goes as far to say this, but he might. Others have. That talent, as we think of it, in a way, doesn't exist. And skill acquisition is essentially more about just application and repetition. Applying yourself, taking. Everyone's terrible at first, and then you try, and then you kind of observe and see, what you did right, what you did wrong. Okay, let's fix what we did wrong. Try two, try three, and on and on and on, ad infinitum. And that's essentially what makes people great at something. And that there isn't much. There is some now, naturally. If you're Shaquille O'Neal, right? You've got a body designed 7'4" to be a great basketball boy. If Shaquille O'Neal's goal in life though was to be the world's greatest horse jockey, he'd have never made it, right? Just like horse jockeys are almost impossible for them to play in the NBA. There's not no limitations. If you're born with a say your umbilical cord, got tied around your neck in the womb or something, and there, some of these mishaps, you ended up being oxygen deprived and with a 75 or 80 IQ. you're not going to end up in a you're probably going to be very hard to become a professor at that point. So there are. It's not that there's no limitations, but that most of us land within this sort of range in most things, most vocational choices out there. That it's not. There's not that much difference, and it isn't really talent that makes a difference on who rises to the top and who doesn't. Um, it, and essentially, and I must say, I noticed this when I used to. Sorry, it's my cat. um, the when I remember when I used to tutor kids in the, way back when, and a lot of the kids who would come to me would be kids that had really struggled in writing in school. They were often they had learning disabilities and things like that sometimes, but one thing, even the kids with the learning disabilities, what it really was, the most common problem I saw, it was emotional. It was these kids had struggled. At something in the school that their classmates hadn't, and a sort of anxiousness that sort of built up in them. And boy, it doesn't take long. And when you're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and that and it happens two or three times, and that can be a very strong sort of impulse, that sort of pit in your stomach you get, when you don't want the teacher to call on you in class, or once you screw something up, that can quickly become a kind of trigger point and a pattern, and man, that just can compound both negatively, just like if it's the thing, and most of us. And here's where sort of how most of us tend to gravitate more toward the math sciences. I would say about 80% of us, maybe more, just off the top of my head. We tend to have more of a proclivity toward the math sciences, and the kids who do have a proclivity that would tend to not love, tend to struggle at least a little with the humanities, the Englishes, histories, philosophies, and so forth, and vice versa. And but that is usually the difference in talent for the most part tends to be a kind of an amorphous thing. And it's the things you sort of get comfortable at, and you do it. And whatever mistake you do make, you don't get all anxious about it. You don't worry, like all right, what else can I do? And it sort of becomes more like an interesting, like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle. And when that's your attitude about it, and you're kind of relaxed, then you do the next repetition, and then the next, and that compounding, kind of takes you, it just sort of loops up for you. And one of the best ways of doing this sort of consciously would be something Candace Erickson called deliberate practice, which is based, I'm not going to get too into this, it's worth looking up, by the way. There's a book, Talent is Overrated, by Jeff Colvin, that dealt with this quite well. I'm quite sure it's in Outliers, too, the Gladwell book we'll cover a bit later. It's also actually in this book, in Mastery, as well. And deliberate practice is just basically a very focused practice. You're really trying to get better. It's often not particularly enjoyable. You're working at you're basically looking for your mistakes and then taking them and then trying to design some way of a repetitive practice to make you better at those mistakes. So it's not just going out as if you're a golfer, for example, and just going to the driving range and just whacking the hell out of the ball and seeing how far you can hit it for half an hour and then going home. No, you don't get better that way. It's really trying to keep it straight and getting a repeatable swing down and all that sort of thing. So anyway, deliberate practice is the other thing, and again, doing deliberate practice over and over again, building up again, it's an ability to focus that'll help you more than anything. And 10,000 hour rule, which will come up more with the Gladwell piece, but chapter, and that is essentially, we'll talk about that more when we get to Gladwell, but he had some problems with Gladwell's interpretation of it, and basically that it takes a long time to become like a master and become great at something. And it's not that you don't become good, and you don't constantly sort of improve along the way, but the masters, the best of the best sort of people, it's about 10,000 hours, and you can probably only do about 4 of this. And so basically, those 10,000, it's hard to do too much more than 1,000 hours a year of deliberate practice. There's only so much sort of focus someone has for that. So that 10,000 is so. And again, sometimes it happens in 2,000, sometimes it takes 20. So there was a lot of variation on that, which is the part he didn't think Gladwell dealt with well thoroughly enough. But anyway, that's talent isn't really quite what we think it is, and that's. Focus and a deliberate practice is the way to really build skills, and that it takes about 10,000 hours to sort of master skills. Though that was the basic, those are sort of the basic parameters of the findings of K. Anders Ericsson. Okay, and now we're going to have three different readings on interpreting that raw research. The first, again, is from, and I just did the introduction here, Robert Greene's Mastery, a book worth reading, by the way. A lot of fascinating stories in there, and it's pretty well done. And the lens Robert Greene kind of uses to interpret all this is basically evolutionary theory. And his basic point was that human beings, evolved over time, right? Just as our eyeballs sort of came around to the fact we got stereoscopic binocular vision, right? Which allowed us to see color and actually gives us the best sight, I think, of almost all land animals other than predatory, I think, birds like hawks and eagles and things. And it allows us to pick out the fruit, the ripe fruit in trees. And when our much smaller and hairier hominid ancestors were up in those trees, but also as they kind of come down from those trees, and again they were very small, they were very weak. If you've ever gotten down to the Natural History Museum, which I highly recommend if you don't, and seen little Lucy in there, God boy, Lucy must have been maybe 4 feet, high, almost like a dwarf size, for us now. And we think she died, falling out of a tree. Again, I don't know, I found a very emotional thing, sort of looking at the almost intact fossil of it's in a glass case of the oldest. Hominid ancestor that exists, or Homo sapien. Anyway, as they got better with this, they would come, at some point they have to come down to food up in the trees, and they were very, prey to be saber-toothed tigers and things like that. They're extremely dangerous down there. They learned to sort of scan, scan across the horizon. And again, our brain, our optic nerve, which is really first connected with our eyes and then to our brains, that. As we sort of exercise that, it gets stronger and stronger. We start being able to see more into the distance. We get very good depth perception because of the way our eyes are aligned, and we can sort of figure out if it's okay. Basically, we would have been, our ancestor would have been sitting up in that tree, watching, maybe a saber-tooth tiger or something take down some animal. And then would have watched the sort of prehistoric hyenas or whatever, the sort of scavenger animals come and pick it, and then there'd still be a little bit left in there. There was still some marrow and everything in the bones to eat, and that's when we would kind of come down out of the trees. We're still a little bit worried, and you'd sort of again scan the horizon to go out there and take get what nourishment you could and make it back, and you're very vulnerable out there. So learn to do that. And then again, you learn to stare for longer periods of time, and then you start planning routes, right? Okay, if he comes, you start looking at which route you'll take away from that carcass is going to be the best. You'll give you your best survival chances if something does surprise you while you're out there. And out of all this, we start plan. You learn planning, and once you start to plan, you start kind of developing a memory, and all this evolves and evolves and evolves, and that's and eventually, by the way, and then that's our and that's where sort of thinking we think kind of comes from. And the second part of this would be our social ability, and that's where hunting comes from. And we tended to hunt things like woolly mammoths and things in packs. and we had to communicate and work together. And also, when you do this, you have to sort of be able to look into one another's faces and really pick up extremely subtle social cues. And we're still fantastic at this, by the way, which is part of the problem in things like social media, right? Where we lose all that and we end up being like just, fucking rage monkeys, right? When we're talking to each other on Twitter and things sometimes. You really do need to be, because also, you have to stay within your tribe. The other tribe is going to, maybe kill you, and if when you're just like you guys kill the other, strangers meant danger, and you usually killed them before they killed you, sort of thing back then, and so. Again, an ability to really subtly and accurately and quickly read social cues, facial expressions, body language, things like that. And in a way that's very intuitive, by the way. Um, was of supreme importance, and it was literally a matter of life and death. And that's why fear of being ostracized is a huge deal. Teenagers go through this, right? When they're all of a sudden the one out, in their friend group or something, right? Or the kid who gets picked on. And that is and just why we're so terrified of public speaking, because all the tribe's attention, is sort of on us, and that is something to be greatly feared, because the rejection, that's still sort of stamped into our DNA. To be rejected by that could put us out in the cold and leave us vulnerable, and give us a very low survival chances. So anyway, those are the two things in the human brain. Our brains grow. A lot of people think it was from hunting and all the planning and communication that goes on with that. But essentially, Greene's point would be that we learn to be able to think. We start using tools and things like that, and we just sort of learn to think inside things. And eventually the guy who was the best at making the arrowheads and things was the one who made them, in the tribe. And they got amazingly skilled. And I don't know if you've ever seen some of the Alaska cave paintings and things like that. And the way those guys did that, by the way, is they would chew pigment in their mouth, colored clay and things, and take a hollowed out reed and spit it out of the reed onto the cave walls. And if you see these, some of these are, considering the methods they were using and how long ago this was, and I think some of these are as old as 40 and 50,000 years old, 40,000 anyway, I believe. Check me on that one. But we're actually had a decent amount of detail, and we're pretty accurate representations. But anyway, as we, the more we sort of practice something and get good, and it becomes an extension of ourselves, and almost becomes a sort of exoskeletal appendage, right, of who we are. If you've ever seen a great pianist, or something there like that, right? They don't just. And again, if your ear is really tuned, and again, most of us these days aren't too attuned to classical music and stuff. But whatever your music style is, there's someone who seems to be better than anyone else at that is. And there's something about that. They've so internalized all the rules and all the methods and the proclivities of that particular art form that they have absorbed into themselves and then mixed it in with their very being, it seems like, and then it's come back out, and their expression of it is just so only that, like, that musician the second you hear a few bars of their things. I could do this with writers. You want to give me a paragraph of Dickens or Faulkner or Hemingway or Virginia Woolf, I will be able to tell them apart without too much difficulty, because of how many hours I've spent sort of immersed in their language in the subtle ways. In the same way people can subtly tell all kinds of facial cues, even if they can't completely explain how they can, right? And they're usually, and by the way, the tests have been done on average people with this, and we're all very good at it. But we're not all very good at that and everything else. And, when it comes to reading literature, I kind of am. I'm not, when it comes to the piano or shooting a basketball or a million other things. But anyway, whatever that thing is, it is that ability to sort of turn that into sort of your own sort of personal expression. That is a sort of a mark of mastery, and the best way of getting there is through this sort of deliberate practice, and which is, basically breaks down to an ability to focus. and which is why setting aside blocking hours where you're not doing anything else and that phone's not pinging, and focusing on it over and over and over again is the way you sort of wind that. And that is how we evolved. We evolved to focus for long periods of time. We did not evolve to scan around all over the place, and then bouncing, answering a text and going online and then playing a game for a couple, and then going back and reading it, and all the whole, sort of multitasking is sort of working against the grain of evolution, and the grain of evolution is a deeply worn groove inside all of us. And to think we're going to be able to sort of reverse that just in our own lifetimes is probably shallow and silly thinking. So anyway, that is Greene's mastery, and again, this is interpreting the work and the raw research of K. Anders Ericsson on expertise through an evolutionary lens. All right.